But we have a lot on our plate. So as promised, we're going to start by opening it up for general discussion, comments, reaction, primarily to what comments that Professor Unger made at the end, but it's also open more broadly as well. So.
But the same issues will come up again in the succeeding steps of our conversation. Yes.
I'm going to be the first, but here I go. So, Professor.
Loud, please.
Okay. In the last class, you criticized the Roderick's position, basically supporting a different way to thinking about the future and thinking about the institutional imagination. In this way, the main idea is not to think only about what happened in the past and make some empirical evaluation or historical or have a historical perspective on what happened in the past, but thinking about the future and the possibilities of the future. And these possibilities basically in two areas: to diffuse the most advanced way to produce and democratize society. This is what I thought was the basic idea. However, my doubt when I listened your points was about the starting point to do that, because Professor Roderick offered a kind of, not a guideline, but a perspective that's really summarized, and you can, is a really a good starting point to thinking about the future and to imagine other institutions. I would like to ask you, what do you think about the starting point to thinking about the future? If it's not the points that Professor Roderick put in the class before, what are the points? This is mine.
Well, first of all, let me place that part of the conversation in context. So, I described 5 approaches to thinking about institutions. Remember, one of them was the one that I called the purist approach, according to which economics has no institutional commitments, not even to the idea of the market. Then the second was the fundamentalist approach, the reification of a particular vision of the market. Historicism turns out to be a false escape from the choice between those two positions, and thus arises the attempt to find an intermediate position between the purist and the fundamentalist. And I cited 2 examples of this attempt to find an intermediate position: the idea of law-like relations between large-scale economic aggregates, and the idea that Roderick presented to the class of economics as generating general principles that select a set of institutional arrangements, but are compatible with a wide range of institutional variations. And I gave reasons why I think that both of those attempts fail. So then the question is, what other way do we have of thinking about institutions in general? And actually, in today's discussion, I want to say some more about institutions in general, because I skipped over that in my remarks. So the particular aspect that I emphasized was a characteristic of the theoretical projects of great economic thinkers in the past, such as Smith and Marx, who attempted to understand the most general characteristics of the economy by studying the most advanced practice of production in their time. They had the view, which I share, that the best way to understand what is fundamental about the economy is to study the most advanced productive practice. So, for example, to suggest to you how this method is not just about programmatic alternatives, but is about also ways of understanding. The regularity or constraint in economic life that may have the best claim to be considered a universal law of the economy is the constraint of diminishing returns. And yet, there's some reason to believe that the now most advanced practice of production, the knowledge economy, holds the promise of relaxing or even reversing this constraint of diminishing returns. So that's an example of how the study of the most advanced practice of production can lead us or force us to reconsider our ideas about the workings of the economy. Another example were my remarks about the relation between the worker and the machine. In the light of this most advanced practice of production, we are led to rethink our understanding of the relation between human activity in the economy and the machine. The worker ceases to mimic the machine. There is the potential for the worker to be one step ahead of the machine. And then we have to ask ourselves, what is it that is distinctively human in economic activity, that which not even in principle machines could do, and so forth. So it's true that in that final part of my comments, I emphasized a view of the potential, the promise, the direction. But that view was necessarily informed by a conception of how economies work. So there's always a relation between our understanding of how something works and our insight into its transformative possibilities. And that relation is crucial to every form of social and economic insight. Yes?
You say in the book you place economic growth as one of the aims.
Wait, book?
Economic growth?
Book? Which book?
The one we read.
This book that's, yeah, okay.
Right at the beginning, you say economic growth is not the only aim, but it's an important aim.
Yes.
And you also say, and you said in class, and you said today again, that we should base our thinking on the most advanced practice of production, the knowledge economy. So my question is the following. If Gordon is right, and if the digital and the knowledge economy is not the source of growth as we think it is, how do we reconcile, why should we look at the knowledge economy if there's no growth coming out of it?
Well, you'll allow me to postpone that discussion because it's the topic for next week, the knowledge economy. I'll simply say dogmatically, by way of anticipation, that to my mind, a fundamental cause of economic stagnation in these societies is the restriction of the most advanced practice of production to insular vanguards from which the vast majority of the labor force and the firms are excluded. So it's not true that the most advanced practice of production now, the knowledge economy, does not have revolutionary implications for growth. What happens is that it's quarantined And its confinement is related also to the superficiality of the achievement of its potential. As a practice of production spreads, it also becomes deeper. It deepens itself, it reveals its potential in the course of spreading. But this is the subject for next week rather than for today. So I have to answer you by denying the premise, the empirical premise, that there's no close connection between this revolutionary form of production and economic growth. Yes?
I think that, this is my take on that the discussion in the economical sphere is mainly confused between what is the aim and what are the tools to get to the aim. No, you said in the last, and you continue to write about it, say it every time, you say vulgar transcendence. And I found in a couple of years ago a very interesting article of Keynes, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren.
Yes.
Which Keynes, as a serious economist in the end, need to contemplate about the issue of that you mentioned now, the difference between work and activity, or free activity. And when you read Marx, you see that this is most of the thing that was made out of Marx's late writing is a vulgarization of his early writing, which he talked a lot about work and free activity, how to release someone from alienation, Offenburg, how you call it in German. And I think that we need in this discussion to say what is the aim, and to agree about it. If the aim is a society which we can call a progressive society, a free society, a society that people can be involved in, then the discussion how to take some of your suggestions, Professor Roderick, I can be more open to it because I can see where I'm going with it. But if the end game is with those suggested, so the question is what will happen with the society? So I don't think there is real argument if we look at it in that way, because even if you use a GDP of that Keynes students invented here in the States, and you understand that he understood which kind of transformation will happen in the society if we live in a society of full employment for 40 years, then we can start managing the real discussion and the most important discussion.
The most important discussion being the discussion about the purpose, the goal.
The process, but in order to talk about the process, we need to agree on the goal.
Yes. So again, this was not at the forefront of our discussion so far in the course, but you're entirely right to draw our attention to this larger subject, which is political and philosophical and not just narrowly economic. So I'll just say this. Keynes and Marx both shared the view that first, scarcity was about to be overcome. They both had that view in the next historical period. And second, that the overcoming of scarcity would allow us to be liberated from the nightmare of work. Their view of production was fundamentally instrumental. We do it because we have to do it. And once we overcome scarcity, we'll be freed from it, and we'll be able to devote ourselves to the sublime. Now, I believe that they were mistaken in both of these ideas. First, it's not true that we're about to overcome scarcity, and this is a long argument. Scarcity in all of its forms, and especially relative scarcity, is reproduced in new ways as the economy advances. So that is, as it were, the deflationary claim. But it's balanced by a claim of hope. And the claim of hope is, contrary to what Marx and Keynes believed, it's also not true that work needs to be purely instrumental. The economy is not just a terrain of constraint, a nightmare of service, but can be a terrain of emancipation, of human self-construction, in which we transform ourselves by seeking to transform the world. And this also is related to the discussion of the most advanced practice of production. One of the criteria that makes one practice of production more advanced than another is that it is closer to the imagination, to the imaginative side of the mind. And that it requires in its performance a higher degree of creative discretion and of reciprocal trust. And this changes the character of economic life. So fundamental answer to your question is we seek economic growth both for instrumental reasons and for reasons that are more than instrumental. We seek it because it lifts from humanity the burden of poverty, infirmity, and drudgery. But we also seek it because we hope to create a form of practical economic activity that is not just enslavement to material need, but that allows us to express in our economic activity our higher human powers. Yes. Yes.
Can I have a terminological clarification? Probably because I'm not enough to speak it, but you put a lot of emphasis on the idea of practice. And in my background, there is a clear distinction between practice and technology. So when you speak about the most advanced practice of production,
Yes.
do you imply that there is a significant difference with the technique of production? I just want to know if I'm reading too much into it, or if there is a meaning attached to the term practice that is not.
So I don't think a practice of production is defined solely or even primarily by the technologies that are associated with it. It's defined by a way of working, a set of practices in an institutional context associated with technology. So, for example, with respect to this knowledge economy, it's a discussion now for the next stage of our course. I believe that it's a mistake to associate it narrowly with the high technology industry or with any particular set of technologies, such as artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, additive manufacturing, and so forth. The conception that I want to propose of this advanced practice of production is that it is a transformation in the way of working and of thinking, and only secondarily the adoption of a new set of technologies. However, your question raises the more fundamental point about how we should think about technology in general. And one way of thinking about technology, especially in the light of the recent course of economic history, is that technology is, as it were, the material channel, the connection between our experiments in the transformation of nature, in the mobilization of natural powers to our benefit, and our experiments in the transformation of the way that we work together, our experiments in the transformation of cooperative regimes. That's really what technology is, and that technology connects those two things. And the more deeply it connects them, the more advanced it is. So I think it's a mistake to fix on the physical contraptions outside this larger context. Should we go on? I mean, there's a bunch of things to say about institutions, but in general, but I was thinking of making these remarks about institutions in general at the beginning of my response now to Danny's analysis of the problems of development. Would you like to say something, Danny, in the continuation of this argument about the idea of the fundamental principles, the higher order principles?
Yeah,
So I'm not sure.
exactly the right order to do it. But since we, I mean, there are several discussions we're having, we're running
Together.
together in parallel. You and I have the advantage that we've done this before.
Yes.
And we know where one argument starts, where it's going.
Yes. Yes.
Not everybody here is. So I do want to say something about these universal principles and how economics relates to some of your ideas. Let me just maybe preface it by saying, in relation to some of the comments you've made, I think a lot of your comments have as their background and as part of the complaint about contemporary economics is that contemporary economics has really changed very much from the days of Adam Smith and Karl Marx and even Keynes. And I think the way in which it has changed, I think it's constructive, and I think it's important to be upfront about what that is, because I think it helps elucidate part of our disagreement that it might be helpful for the class. I think all those grades, historical grades of economics, thought about the economy, but it also had conception about sort of what, they brought us perspectives about what an economy should look like. So they had ideas and conceptions and models of an economy. And I think increasingly what economics has become, it has been a conception about how to think about the economy and not about the shape of the economy. Now, you like the idea that economists at some point had a conception about what the economy should look like, even though you're rejecting each one of those. And by the way, Keynes, Smith, and Marx aren't the only ones. Of course, you reject also Hayek's conception of the economy, the other one. Probably the most sort of recent contemporary version, Milton Friedman, it hasn't been mentioned. He had a conception of the economy, but of course you reject those as well. And I think what has happened is that economics has become less about having a conception about, what political philosophers or political theorists might call sort of the good life, or in terms of its extension into the good economy, and much more about sort of how to think about the economy. Now, I think there has been a considerable loss in that transition, but also that is gained. And I think that's the background to our disagreement. And I think the loss is the loss of this institutional imagination. That economics has lost this conception of sort of what is it that we ought to be striving for? What's the vision of a socially inclusive economy?
that achieves in its sort of broad aims not just material advancement, but also inclusiveness and where individuals are able to fulfill their capabilities. Very little about contemporary economics is really about that. And so to that extent, if you say, there's no Keynes anymore, yes, there is no Keynes anymore. Now, to me, sort of the advantage of sort of what the economics has gained is in some sense that at least academic economics has become a little bit de-ideologized as a result, because of this dropping of the pretension that economics, or at least economists, have any kind of priority among other social scientists or other intellectuals about having, sort of being able to say something about, what an inclusive market economy looks like. And that might mean that we've lost, there are no more Keynes or his predecessors, but it also means the fact that we don't have Hayek's and Friedman's either, because those also were visions, and even though they claim their visions were based on how to think about the economy, now we can safely say, because we have focused explicitly about how to think about the economy, that in fact their visions were very narrow versions about narrow institutionalizations of how to think about the economy. So that's the sense in which I think sort of where I come from and where I think contemporary economics adds a richness to this debate is it has given up some of its it has given up considerably its institutional imagination and its normative claims, but it's gained the discipline about how to think about what's feasible and what are the ways that one can move forward, how to think about different economic agents relate to each other, how to think about constructing these elements. So to put it sort of in some sense very crudely, and I think this is for the class as I think about what is it that we're trying to do here. From my perspective, what we're trying to do is have everybody share in a kind of exercise in disciplined imagination. And I think, sort of, the imagination is going to come mostly from you, because I'm an economist, so I have all the professional problems that I just laid out. But I think in your presentation, it was all sometimes although I know you don't think about it this way, I think there is an undercurrent of appearance of sort of that this imagination, this institutional flexibility and malleability can be relatively undisciplined. And I think I would like to suggest that where that useful discipline comes from is actually in terms of what economics brings to the debate, which you may find as sort of, just presenting the bill, as you put it at the very end of the discussion last week. But in terms of presenting a menu of what's available, what's feasible, what are the upside and downsides of different options, it seems to me that discipline, as contemporary economics brings into things, is absolutely essential. So I want to go on because this is fairly abstract, but I want to make this maybe a little bit more concrete in the context of today's discussion, or today's topic, which is growth. So if you'll allow me, I'll go.
But I want to say something about that, because I'm not going to let that pass. Okay.
Yeah, the only question is whether you want to do it now, or you want to do it specifically in the context of sort of, the concrete version of this argument in the context of growth. But maybe we should do. You want to go in there? And then I reserve the right to.
Sure. So Danny has just presented a version of the argument which makes it seem that our positions don't necessarily contradict each other. But they do contradict each other, and so yeah. So no. And the particular form of peaceful coexistence that he proposes is that I'm interested in alternatives, and the normative, and the discipline as it's organized is primarily interested in something else. Its de-ideologizing is not a recent phenomenon. That was one of the main points of the marginalist revolution at the end of the 19th century, which subsequent economics of a certain kind, the kind I called fundamentalist, in some sense tried to reverse or to compromise. We have a series of disagreements about understanding, not just about prescription, about method, not just about proposal. So just to anticipate one of the dimensions of that disagreement, and perhaps the dimension that has proved most recalcitrant to our discussion, is this view. So in this economics that resulted from marginalism at the end of the 19th century, fundamental practice is to generate models with certain values or parameters that are stipulated against the background of a form of analysis that is itself empty of particular causal, factual, or normative commitments. If the model doesn't work, you create another model by changing the values and the parameters. At no point in this diversification of models is the underlying theory, the way of thinking, undermined, because it was never meant to be descriptive in the first place. It's a pure logical apparatus, which, when understood and applied with sufficient rigor, is invulnerable to subversion. Now, that's no good for a science. That's what I described last week as eternal infancy. It's not at all like fundamental physics, for example. The standard model of particle physics makes a particular claim about the organization of nature at the micro level. And if the claim is subverted by an accumulation of contrary facts, there's a revolution in fundamental physics. There's not just another model. And so this is an example of one dimension among many in which it's my view in the debate is that what is in question is also the basic approach to economic phenomena, the way of explaining. The fundamental issue is the difficulty that this science, like all contemporary social sciences, has in understanding structure and structural transformation. Each of the contemporary social sciences evades structural insight in a different way. The way in which pure economics evades it is by agnosticism, corrupted by the market fundamentalism, which then has this crude reification of the market. So agnosticism is, again, a strategy that I call Pontius Pilate. Don't blame me. I don't have commitments to this or to that. I have this pure form of analysis. Within this pure form of analysis, you can generate models. And if the model doesn't work, you make another model. But at no point is there a theoretical disruption or revolution. That operation, that explanatory strategy, leads us into a dead end, into an intellectual desert, and abandons us there without instruments. So that's just by way of anticipating a discussion to have in the future, and by way of insisting that this is not just a debate about the importance of the normative. It's a debate about the method of understanding.
And I will make it a little bit more complete in a second.
Yes.
And talk about precisely how I think economics helps the biggest issues of today, including structural change. So I'll talk about that in that context.
Yeah, forgive me, just one clarification, which seems to me enormously important, because it's the use of the term economics. So this is very confusing. So you might think that economics means the study of the economy. But actually, for the most part, it doesn't mean that. Economics means the study of a method that was pioneered by the marginalist theoreticians at the end of the 19th century and its contemporary forms. The application of that method to subjects that are not on their face economic is widely regarded as part of economics. And the study of the economy by some other method is not considered to be economics. So this generates huge confusion. So when you say economics this, economics that, it's not the study of the economy.
I don't want to take on others' agendas
Yes.
and defend a version of economics that I'm not prepared to
I understand.
I set out a version of economics that I'm prepared to defend because I think it's useful, and I think it captures enough of what we do as economics that it's not, it would be considered mainstream, and it's consistent by and large with what's going on in economics today, but I don't want to get into debate about economics as method as opposed to, because I kept my remarks about on that part of economics that are devoted to understanding the economy. So let's keep on.
Yes.
And so let me just talk a little bit about these, what I call these universal principles, and which you resisted, and do that in the context of growth. So I want to come back to these principles, and the issue is what I want to talk about is precisely the question about the relevance, usefulness, or the triviality or the non-universality of these things. Actually, before I was preparing for this, I tried to find, you'll remember the flourish with which Roberto ended at the end of last week. There was something about Rome, a chariot, a slave,
Yes.
blind seer. And then I went to the video because I wanted to remember exactly what you said. But then and then you remember that Roberto hadn't allowed me to start at the beginning before exactly after 10 because he didn't want any of my precious words wasted before the automatic filming started. But it turns out that flourish happened 2 minutes after 3, and then doesn't occur in the video.
Ah.
So it's been lost to eternity. Maybe we'll ask you to at some point
reproduce it.
To reproduce it.
Economics is like the slave
Yes.
standing next to the winner in
No,
the chariot.
no. Allow me later.
Okay, so here are the. Let me go back to because I think we can do this at some level of abstraction, but these are some of the universal principles that I laid out in my discussion last week. And I emphasize that these are things at some level that seem fairly abstract and fairly general and seem obvious, things like property rights incentives or the rule of law. But I also indicated that these things also have technical meanings, that there is whole bodies of literature which we can use to basically parse out what these things mean and how they apply in specific contexts. And it's actually an exercise of that sort that I'm going to be engaging in a particular context. So on the microeconomic side, you have these notions about property rights, incentives, rule of law. Now let me just say that, when I mention property rights and then I explain it as sort of the manner in which property rights matters is not that we privilege any particular legal form of property rights. The manner in which property rights is going to matter is how it's put here, is that essentially to ensure that potential and current investors can retain the returns to their investments. So that's a relatively thin, institution-free description that is immune to the criticism that I'm privileging any particular institutional form. But I think I'm also going to suggest that that doesn't make it trivial at the other end, because you can imagine many settings in which violations of this principle have resulted in economically very undesirable consequences, and people do it all the time. So it bites. So this has meaning. The same thing about incentives in the very specific sense of aligning producer incentives with social costs and benefits. What are social costs and benefits? Huge literatures on precisely doing these, sort of understanding this in specific context. I won't go through them again, sort of on the macroeconomic side, again, sort of a parallel set of incentives. So when I'm talking about universal principles, I have some very specific things in mind. So this is not necessarily the whole list. Might not have stated them in exactly the right way. If I think more about them, I might want to change it. But I want to be very clear and specific that this is the kind of the level at which I'm talking about universality. And I think Roberto is right that I am looking for some intermediate level. That is something that is not so general, that is, in my mind, completely abstract and useless, but not so specific and so institutionalized that, in fact, truly is not universal when we look at the evidence. So I want to look at how these principles fare in some applications and apply them in what is essentially perhaps the most significant economic event of our era, which is the post-1978 economic performance of China. It's the most important event of our era because it's been the most impactful. It's the world's greatest poverty reduction record in economic history. Literally hundreds of millions of people. So it's in terms of overall growth, in terms of poverty reduction, in terms of improvement in social indicators, it's completely unparalleled. So the question is, how do these principles fare, and what do they tell us about what might have happened and why? And in many ways, it's a very tough terrain on which to evaluate these principles or to ask help from these principles, because of course China is a socialist economy. So this is not where you actually expect to find these principles being applied in any particular way in this kind of environment. But in fact, when you look closely at what was happening and some of the absolutely essential key reforms in the post-1978 period in China in terms of what made this feasible, it turns out that it is actually what made this possible is precisely a set of reforms that institutionally looked very different from anything in the West, but actually constituted of nothing else but the application of these very principles. So let me give you some specific examples. One of the earliest reforms in China happened around 1978, was the transition to a pricing system that came to be called two-track pricing. So I need to explain to you a little bit what the system was before and how the system would have been reformed in a Western kind of way, and then third, what the Chinese instead tried to do. The system was essentially that there was a system of price controls that communes, production was organized in communes, and communes had to basically deliver to the state quotas, agreed quotas of whatever they were producing, grains, at a fixed price. So this is a non-market, centrally planned system that basically government sets the price and says, here, you need to deliver to me so many, the commune has to deliver to me so many tons of this or that. So it's a centrally allocated, centrally planned system. From the standpoint of standard economic volume, what you would say, well, this is going to produce not just inefficiency, that seems like too technical a word. What's going to produce is a huge under potential. That is a sort of an economy that's going to be producing hugely below its potential. Now, the standard reform would have been to basically say, if you simply asked a Western economist to say, okay, how would you reform the system? It would say, simply liberalize prices. You basically have to let markets work. And what does letting markets work mean? It would mean sort of, abolish these centrally planned system, abolish these price controls, abolish these requirements that these producers have to deliver grains to the state at agreed prices and fixed quantities. Now, the Chinese didn't do that. They didn't do that actually for a very good reason. And that very good reason had to do with another one of the principles having to do with macroeconomic stability. Because the system operated implicitly as a way of raising tax revenue. Because the government was getting all these crops at cheap prices and then was selling them somewhat more expensively in the urban areas. This was essentially an important source of fiscal revenue, government revenue for the government. So the standard remedy, just focused only on price incentives, would have created a problem somewhere else in the system, would have created a problem with macroeconomic instability. So what did they do? They chose to do something else instead. I'm just presented this as if there was just one committee that sat and decided all of this. The whole process is much more experimental, much more trying and seeing sort of at the margin what works or not. But at the end of the day, what they do is a system of two-track pricing, which essentially leaves the planned system in place that says, farmers, you still have to deliver to us at these fixed prices, these fixed quantities. So the planning is in place. But then says, once you've done that, once you've satisfied your quota, then you can sell in the market any amount, at any price that you want. Okay? So at the margin, it's the markets that rule. And since the marginal principle here for incentives is what matters are the incentives at the margin, that system from an incentive base, from an incentive perspective, exactly mimics what a pure market system with complete absence of the government would have produced, because it produces the right incentives to produce for the market, while has the advantage that it retains, doesn't undermine the fiscal needs of the government, because the government is still getting those inframarginal units. The allocation system, the central planning system is still in place. The government is still getting these cheap grains and selling them somewhat more expensively in urban areas. So you have essentially a system that is satisfying both of these important principles. And so this is a way of thinking both ex post about why the system works so well. And I just provided you with a somewhat simplified, superficial picture of what was happening. It has all kinds of other implications and complementary aspects elsewhere in the system. But it's also a way of thinking how you would design such a major reform, such a major change in economic strategy in a real-world context by simply thinking through the implications of some of these universal principles. And if you think it was just simple or trivial that this nature's government program, that this reform actually happened, I think it's sort of missing the whole point about how sort of the fine-tuned nature of this reform, and of course its implications in terms of what it did. Practically overnight, there was a huge increase in farm output, huge reduction in poverty in the countryside. I'm not going to go through the other kinds of examples with the same kind of detail, but I'll just mention some of the ones that are the better known ones. The household responsibility system. It's a way of effectively the Chinese government enforced property rights, but in ways that was very non-standard, so to speak. Essentially, rather than providing Western-style property rights, the government turned to households and gave them long-term leases over the land that they were working with. Once again, essentially mimicking what the property rights, what you want the property rights regime to do, not to achieve any particular kind of institutional ideal or legal ideal, but to actually give incentives, the right incentives, to the people who are working with the land or with the capital. The famous township and village enterprises was another form of property reform, which essentially also gave, this time, non-agricultural producers the right incentives, especially entrepreneurs who were producing relatively simple manufactures. And once again, it wasn't through a system of formal property rights, but it approximated that by essentially taking into account the institutional context. Because as we discussed last time, the formal system of property rights relies on third-party enforcement, relies on courts, for example, a legal system that's going to enforce those property rights. In the Chinese context, there was nothing like that. Independent courts that could honestly and competently enforce contracts or property rights. So what township, village, and enterprises do is effectively rest property rights in local governments. And the local governments, once they have an incentive in the continued prospering of these enterprises, because the residual profits accrue to them, then they actually have an incentive to ensure that the entrepreneurs with whom they're allied in these TVs also prosper. It's simply a question about ensuring that the goose that lays the golden eggs continues to prosper. Once again, in an intertemporal dynamic way, the right property rights incentives are provided through an institutional form that is highly non-standard. Okay? Now, none of these, of course, I'm suggesting to you as examples that other countries should basically mimic. These are examples of how taking these principles seriously and thinking about what their implications are in a kind of a specific context, and designing your institutions or doing your reforms appropriately can pay off huge rewards. Similarly, with respect to how the economy opened up to the world, these are through special economic zones. Again, a very different way of turning your producers and giving them incentives for participating in world markets. And I don't want to go over that particular. So even though in sort of, in an odd way, when you look at the highly mixed interventionist and heterodox kinds of institutional forms that exist in China, let's say, 10, 15, 20 years after the reforms, after the late 1970s, these turned out to be not a violation, but a confirmation of the importance of these universal principles that I've tried to sort of elucidate in a more abstract way. And these aren't simply trivial, I would argue, because that it takes a while to figure out how these things work and get them to work in a particular setting, because so much is required to make them concrete in a particular context. And they're not also trivial because we know that there are so many examples of cases where you don't abide by the same principles of appropriate incentives, appropriate property rights, or appropriate fiscal sustainability, and then the economy ends up essentially in dire straits or with quite negative consequences. One can, of course, take out a lot of examples, bring out a lot of examples. Unfortunately, Latin America is particularly rich with examples of countries that have succumbed to that, although not lately, but one country that lately provides a good example, of course, of that is Venezuela, or what has happened in Venezuela over the last decade. So it's important to understate that this is a case of a regime that presumably was trying to do well for the people, for the poor. It was meant to be a regime that was progressive. It was meant to be a regime that was providing benefits for its popular base. not necessarily one that came in there with the overt objective of maintaining an oligarchy or stealing resources for a very narrow segment of the elite. But of course, we know what has happened. I think precisely because of sort of these violations of these important principles, that the economy is now in hyperinflation and is going through an economic collapse, with the poorest people, of course, paying the biggest price. So. I think I would say that indeed, going back to the critique, that these things are universally applicable, and they provide precisely, I think, the kind of disciplined thinking about how to move forward. And I don't think they are trivial by any stretch, because creative use of these principles produce significant economic benefits. And explicit disavowal of these principles produce huge economic calamity. We cannot simply disregard them. I think the kind of the rule of thumb is that economic crises produce what in Latin American context is called macroeconomic populism. That is essentially excessive monetary and fiscal expansionary policies that cannot be sustained. That these crises are associated with a drop in real income for the economy as a whole of around 10%, and typically, again, the poor tend to be much worse hit. Now, again, I emphasize that that this sort of way of thinking that can very rapidly get quite technical, and that I haven't gone into, sort of doesn't necessarily provide you with the tools that you need in terms of, where you want to end up. What is it that you want to be? And I think that's what I mean by talking about institutional imagination. It also doesn't give you necessarily with the tools to say that if you were in China in 1978, it doesn't necessarily give you with the way of thinking, what are some of these alternative, institutional forms that I could use, right? Maybe you can just look at, other countries, what have they tried? But there's nothing in this way of thinking that's actually going to necessarily give you a menu or a repertoire or a set of different institutional arrangements from which you can draw, okay? So that, we don't do. And I think, we might, I think that's a failure. Doesn't mean that individual economists don't do it. And I think as the course goes on, I will talk and produce and I will mention about some ideas. But I do think it's part of the failure. So I think we might continue this debate with Roberto. But I think once if we are clear about the terms of our discussion, again, I'm going to repeat something I said earlier. To the extent that I think in your discussion, Roberto, that you engage directly with some of these issues, then I think we actually agree. To the extent that you try to use examples which do not directly engage these kinds of the level of sort of universality that or the specific elements that I'm talking about, I think your use of the examples are not quite correct. So I think, for example, having these universal principles doesn't mean that you may sometimes choose to violate one because of some other principle. For example, that on economic grounds, for example, you used the example last time of sort of universality of social benefits. You might say that universality of social benefits might violate the principle of targeting, and that's a case of how you might want to do something that violates the principle of targeting. The argument you gave was that you want universality because that's the way to get political buy-in. And without universality, these benefits don't have sufficient political buy-in and sustainability and continuity. And that's perfectly fine, but then what that is an example is saying that there is another principle from politics that says that the political sustainability, that in this instance is more important, and you're willing to pay a price. Because the principle of targeting says that you're going to pay a price if you violate that principle. What price you're paying, you're probably having to raise a lot more revenue than you need with all the associated distortions to really necessarily help the people that you really want to help. You're probably helping a lot of other people, middle class, upper middle class people that don't necessarily need to be helped. So that is a case where it is not an argument against the relevance or universality of these things. It's just a case that you're saying, look, there's a non-economic constraint that we need to abide, and we have to compromise on that economic principle. And it's much better to know that you're precisely compromising on that economic principle, because otherwise you may not be prepared for the adverse consequences. So I also wanted to maybe if there is time I'll do it later, but I'll just stop here because I wanted to make a bridge with also some of our discussions on technology
and what about the discussion of development, which is our next theme?
So, yes.
Why don't you go ahead to the discussion of development, and then we'll engage.
I want to simply just presage there. I mean, I think the issue is sort of the technology and development discussions essentially revolve around questions about technology. It's largely a question about how we're going to be addressing technological challenges.
But we're separating the discussion of the new economy, of the knowledge economy, from the discussion of development, the message of classical development economics.
The main issue, yes. So we're going to be separating the question about, so the new economy discussion is one that we will have largely in the context of the advanced economies, although they have implications for developing countries as well. And then when we talk about developing countries, it's largely, I think, the technological aspect of that there is that to the extent that these new technologies are disseminating to mass production techniques in the developing countries, they are making it more difficult for developing countries to emulate the standard development pattern, which is one that was basically based on industrialization. So I think that's the big connection with technology and development. But maybe I can say more about that, or we can go back to our debate.
I think it would be useful to engage the theory and message of classical development economics before we come to the discussion of the knowledge economy, right? Because it's an earlier stage of historical experience and an earlier stage of thought.
Okay, so let me just say a couple of things. So there's the classical sort of understanding of the process of structural change that is associated with economic development and growth. It's a process that essentially today's advanced countries went through in history, and today's most successful among the developing countries also went through. And if you think about sort of very broadly dividing the economy into agriculture, manufacturing, and services, and then you can divide modes of production or the technologies that are being used in each one of these sectors into what I've called here informal and organized, but you may also want to think about really as using very traditional or craft technologies versus using modern, advanced, new technologies. And let's associate those two technologies separately with informal, disorganized versus formal and organized sector. So the classical model of development is a pattern of structural change where the nature of production and workers associated with that change essentially move from traditional informal agriculture and craft-style production to initially significantly into manufacturing. That's called the process of moving into
into the process of industrialization. That happened with the factory system, the mass production, the spread of mass production techniques, and ultimately into services, into tertiary, so post-industrialization. And that's the stage in which today's advanced countries have been. And the mechanism that generates rapid growth in this process is that typically productivity tends to be very high or higher in the organized or more technologically advanced parts of the economy. So if you take people out of traditional agriculture, put them into mass production factories, you're basically increasing their productivity. You might be doubling or tripling their productivity. And that process of structural change is essentially what fuels economic growth during this period of industrialization. And why industrialization, in fact, is such a engine of economic growth is because modern industries are associated with higher productivities than either sort of craft production or informal agricultural, traditional agricultural production. So you can basically take a worker out of traditional agriculture, essentially with very little extra training. So you don't need to skill them up. You don't need to necessarily invest a lot. You put them into, turn them into a production line worker in a factory, and you've increased their productivity by a factor of 2 or 3. That's a large part of why industrialization gives you such a big boost in growth. So in this traditional model of structural change that drives growth, it's basically what's happening. What drives growth is the dissemination of mass production technologies, particularly in industry, that gives rise to an industrial working class, and the expansion of those opportunities to people in informal activities, either in the countryside or in services, that they can become part of that new economy. Let me just say 2 more things, and then we can open up to questions. Now, this is the standard model. This is the classical model. Okay? Now, what is happening, and I think the challenge that today's developing countries face is that this is not happening anymore. Okay? The traditional model of industrialization is dead. It's dead for a couple of reasons. One has to do with the stage of globalization we're at, because a number of countries that have been very successful in specializing in manufacturing, that was originally the East Asian tigers, but then, of course, in a big way, China, a country that we already talked about, with very strong comparative advantage in manufacturers and strong competitive pressure in global markets, that latecomers to industrialization are now finding it's very difficult to compete because they don't have the traditional sort of market segmentation, the traditional production, the traditional protection that either relatively high tariffs or sort of the technological or transport barriers traditionally placed. So, you know, if you're a low-income African country, you don't have protection against the natural protection that you used to have against Chinese and other East Asian exports. So that's probably part of it. But an even bigger part is the nature of the technological transformation of manufacturing, which is actually part. And that's where we make the connection with the new economy in the advanced countries, which is that manufacturing, which tended to be traditionally a relatively low-skill intensive sector that could easily absorb a lot of unskilled workers, has become increasingly more skill intensive and more capital intensive. So that means that manufacturing, even in developing countries today, is no longer has the capacity to absorb as much workers from the countryside as it was. So successively, sort of countries have been able to put fewer and fewer workers into their manufacturing sector. So I think at its peak in the UK, something more than a third of the workforce was in manufacturing. In South Korea, which was a very successful manufacturing country, I think the peak was reached in about 28%. Today, even in Vietnam, which is a successful manufacturing country, is about fewer than 15% of the workforce is in manufacturing. And many countries, in fact, they're starting to deindustrialize at levels of absorption into manufacturing, which is in the low teens or at 15% at most. So what's happening is that it's not that people aren't leaving the traditional agriculture and the countryside, but what's happening is that they're moving directly into informal activities and services, and where their productivity isn't necessarily that much higher. So that traditional model of development has been disrupted because sort of manufacturing has lost its ability to absorb a lot of workers and isn't providing the kind of employment opportunities that historically it did. And therefore, sort of it looks like the major sort of structural transformation is directly into services. And that's a process that I just called premature deindustrialization, or in many African countries, really lack of industrialization. And that, I think, is probably the most important challenge that low-income countries and also middle-income countries face in terms of what's going to be the missing, sort of the historically important engine of development, which is industrialization, is missing in these countries. The question is what takes its place. So there, the whole question about how these new technologies can be used and can be disseminated in a way that can generate employment and productive employment opportunities for a lot of unskilled workers in the developing countries becomes hugely important. So let me just stop this. So this would be sort of like the substantive background to a lot of the discussion about sort of both the new economy and the technological challenges in developing countries that we'll talk about later. So there were a couple of questions. Yeah.
First of all, this is a brilliant chart that explains a lot of the things that we are seeing, and thanks for that. I have a question to you. One of the biggest structural changes we can have is really like Professor Unger noted in a couple of the classes about the issue of the knowledge economy. And in Israel, we have a situation in which there is really the knowledge economy is really entangled into the economy. A wider range of people are in it.
But this is a topic for next week.
Yeah,
So let's try and organize it.
I just want to
Yes.
say a lot about the transformation.
So the new economy is
So
our
when you
topic
said-
next week.
When
So
you said, okay, when you said in the start, this is the issue. Issue is not. You said about an issue of economy, economics, universal rules. So one of the rules is like reasonable debt. And I can say to you, as a fact, that they put in Israel in the last 10 years $70 billion in decreasing of the debt without any reason, and they stopped this entanglement of the continue of this trend in Israel because of the reasonable debt. And they used the debt of the Maastricht of 60% and all that. So when you say these rules, how can I know where to apply them? Because reasonable debt, when I read it, it's like.
No. I think the question is an important one, and I think the question is how would you actually apply these principles in a particular context? So you're asking, so there is, one of these universal principles is fiscal and debt sustainability. Now that's sort of defined as a situation where you ensure that in the medium to longer term, that the stock of debt isn't outpacing the repayment capacity, and that's typically taken to be the overall GDP if we're talking about, let's say, the public debt. Now, so without getting too much into the specific technical aspects of this, let me just say a couple of things. One is that this principle doesn't imply any particular numerical debt ceiling. So in that way, sort of the 60% Maastricht criteria, for example, is a political decision. It's based on a political judgment. It's based on a political compromise. Now, it's driven in part by the universal principle that says that, okay, you want to ensure that there is some discipline on how rapidly that can grow. But the principle itself, the economics itself, doesn't tell you that that ceiling is 60% any more than it says that the ceiling should be 40% or 90%. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean that the principle is empty. It means that, this is it forces a particularly disciplined debate that requires you to make projections about what is the dynamics of the debt, how is it accumulating, what is the dynamics of the denominator, the GDP, how is that changing, what is a reasonable range for the growth of GDP, what's a reasonable debt accumulation mechanism, right? And that gives you a certain discipline about what you can say about what's going to be reasonable or not. And again, it doesn't mean that two different economists coming at this issue using the same tools will, in the end, necessarily agree on. So in that sense, that is not what that this forces. However, it forces a convergence over what are the things that they would disagree on. In other words, so that is the discipline that is caused. So I think, and this is the same in each one of these, because in each one of them says incentives requires this, you can say incentives requires that. I mean, there's this fair amount of discussion that is feasible, but it would be misleading to say that therefore it's so open-ended that anything goes. So there's a certain amount of skepticism with respect to sort of specific institutional or policy conclusions, but it doesn't result in complete agnosticism in the sense that anything goes. Yeah.
I have a question. So understanding a complex system, we're trying to understand a complex system and how it deals with issues. I have a question with the level of aggregation and abstraction we're going there. So we're talking about having a sound fiscal debt. Is this the right aggregation level that we should look, or is it something before, like a discussion, a more abstract discussion on how we deal with time, with risks, or with exchange and commitments? How we're sure we're not seeing the atoms, like if you think of parallel with physics, the atoms of Dalton versus the atoms of Bohr. How you're sure that looking at fiscal debt is the right lens we're looking at in this scale? And the second is the ideologization that you mentioned. The fact that by seeing this level of aggregation, you might be structuralizing and creating a bad dependency because you are already assuming that debt exists, the financial markets exist. How you're sure this is not preventing us to go to very alternative, different solutions, and that this is not being captured by an ideology already?
It's entirely possible. I'm captive to some ideology that I'm not. So I'm open to your second round, which is to say, look, you've picked the wrong thing. So if you have that second round, let's have that discussion. So I don't want to be, I don't want to be just sort of dogmatic and say, no, this is completely, sort of de-ideologized. But if you think that the first point that you made with respect to how there might be some prior principles that might, to some extent, that is true, I think, and that's where there's a certain element of judgment. For example, a quick example that comes to mind is look, the issues about debt perhaps shouldn't matter at all if you have the right incentives in the first place. So if financial institutions, borrowers, creditors, and the government all have the right incentives, they'll, as indicated by my first column, they'll internalize the social consequences of all their behavior, and therefore, from a social perspective, they'll never behave opportunistically, and therefore it's redundant to have another principle that puts a kind of a discipline on debt. So you might say maybe that's just superfluous because there's something else. But as but from a practical standpoint, I think there is something to be said that there is something very. I'm willing to make the argument that the second column things which sound like these neoliberal right-wing things about sound money and fiscal sustainability are not. These are, I think, if we use them sensibly, they should be part of the toolkit of the most sort of progressive left-wing groups. But if you want to argue against that and say, no, I think progressive should completely should not be reined in by concerns about sound money and fiscal sustainability. I'm happy to I'm happy to have that argument.
So I just have a question about the general principles. I think I really like this model, and I was just wondering, if you do implement all these general principles, what is its limit? Like, where does it take us? And do you, for example, have like a country in mind that you feel has sort of reached the potential of the general principles, and then for them to continue growth beyond that point, it takes a different kind of innovation or institutional innovation? It's too bad that Roberto isn't right now here, because he might have something to say about that. That he might say that perhaps. So the question here is, but I'll ask you to repeat that question, because I think it might also provide a prompt for Roberto to come in. So if you can just repeat. Sure. The question was, like, if you take the example of like China, and they apply these universal principles, then it gives them this sort of launching pad to get into economic growth and grow at a very fast pace. But my question was, if you do apply these universal principles, where does that take us? Like, where is the dead end? And beyond that point, how is there? So I asked Professor Roderick whether there was a country in mind that he had that kind of is the paragon example of these 6 principles that have been applied. And now, to continue growth beyond that point, they have to think of like a new innovative process. Personally, I think of the example of, for example, South Korea. I think these principles have been applied, but there's high levels of unemployment. Growth is not as fast as it once used to be. There's high levels of inequality. I think one of the tailwinds that we're seeing very quickly was one of the problems. So I was just wondering, where do countries like that go from there? Because they have applied the universal principles, and we're stuck.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I would concede a little bit in that direction, but not a whole lot. I mean, I think that as societies develop, and I think as their institutions and capabilities and social arrangements change, I think the nature of the economic challenges they face also changes. And I think you're right that to the extent that a country like South Korea has already become a wealthy economy and has practices and institutions that in large part of the economic domain has already internalized some of these principles, that the challenges have become somewhat different, and therefore one might want to think about, so these are still relevant and apply, and giving up on them would be hugely costly. But that's not where the real issues are in some sense. And I think, and that might force me to think a little bit more about, sort of what kind of a society, South Korea wants to be, and what are the roadblocks there. And that might lead me to a somewhat different menu. So I'm open to that.
So to your question, where do the universal principles lead? I believe there are 2 answers. One is they lead nowhere, and the other is they lead in the wrong direction. And both of these answers are correct. No, they are both correct, depending on how much content we choose to give them. So I don't want to persist in this discussion, because it would occupy our whole time. But I'll simply signal an area of disagreement. One of the ways of describing why this idea of universal principles fails is to say that to every one of these supposed universal principles, there exists a contrary principle, a counter principle. And the counter principle is not a non-economic principle, it's an economic principle. So let's take the example of monetary and fiscal policy. universal principle, maintain the nominal demand for money balances stable. That principle may then be trumped
That's not
by,
what it says.
by the counter principle.
That's not what it says.
Well, say it then. Say it.
The sound money principle is that you want to increase liquidity in line with the growth in the demand for real balances.
Yes, sure. So it's then trumped by the counter principle, manage the economy countercyclically. And that counter principle is then trumped by yet another counter principle, except if the state is initiating a rebellious strategy of national development that is then more important than the normal attractions of counter-cyclical monetary and fiscal policy.
It's not negated by countercyclical.
No, but it's not negated. It creates a play of multiple principles, all of which are properly economic.
Roberto, your counter-argument is, I think, only shows how important these principles are, because it's so easy to misunderstand them. And I think that the notion of countercyclical monetary policy does not violate that principle.
Then the state comes and says, we may need a fiscal and monetary cushion in order to deviate. And to do that, we will sacrifice the Keynesian practices.
That was what I said about how if you had another, but then be
they will
clear
produce,
that you are going to pay an inflationary price. So that's the point, is that, yes, if you think that, if you decide that your political strategy requires that you
No, but I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying that the rebellious state may need to do something that on its surface mimics 1920s style monetary policy. That is, to build up sound finance doctrine, a cushion of reserves, extreme fiscal responsibility, mimicking the doctrine of austerity, but for the sake of rebellion.
Then you pay a price in terms of unemployment
yes,
and
of course,
recession.
but this isn't an argument that real economic decisions don't have costs and consequences. The question is whether there is some framework of principles that provides guidance. And I'm saying that in every one of these areas, there's an interplay of principles and counter-principles. And there's no higher order principle that commands the orchestration of these contrary principles.
But Roberto, you're conflating the prioritization of the objectives with the statement of what the objective would require if you were single-mindedly focused on the objective.
It's not an argument that each of these options doesn't have costs and consequences. It can't be that. That would make no sense. The issue that is brought up by your model is whether there's some framework of general principles that stops short of market fundamentalism, but selects a class of feasible institutional arrangements.
It does not select, it opens. It opens up a class. It doesn't select because we don't know what that set is, but it provides you a filter whereby you can, sort of candidates for institutional reform can be passed through that filter to describe their likely economic consequences and to what extent they would produce the objectives associated with those principles if those objectives were part of your agenda in the first place.
So let's continue this discussion.
Okay.
But
maybe there are more comments and questions on this, or should we just, before we completely close it off?
But maybe we could come back to it because we really haven't discussed the issue of development economics, and I wanted at least to begin with that.
Okay. But please don't go over, because if you end in a flourish.
No, well. So I will speak very telegraphically and make three sets of remarks. First, I want to go back to last week's discussion of institutions and make three remarks about institutions, how to think about institutions. Then I want to make remarks about what would be today's central topic of development economics and what we have learned from it. And then in my third set of remarks, build a bridge to our future discussion of the knowledge economy. So first, institutions. Here are three ideas about how to think about institutions. So first is, what are they, these institutional and ideological regimes? The structure, the framework. The framework always has two sides, the institutional side and the ideological side. It's not just a set of institutions, it's a set of conceptions in the light of which the institutions are thought out. The preservation or transformation of these regimes is the supreme object of political activity. And the understanding of them and of how they changed is the highest target of theoretical ambition in social and economic thought. One way to think of these regimes is that they are a kind of frozen fighting. There's a contest in society over the organization of social life, practical and visionary strife. And this contest is contained or interrupted, never completely. And the regimes are the residue of this containment or interruption. So think of it as a kind of game of musical chairs. The music is the strife. The music stops, and everyone sits down on the nearest chair. Those are the regimes. Now, the significance is then that they're not like natural phenomena. There's no inherent structure. These are simply the results of this interruption or containment of ideological and practical fighting in historical experience. The second observation has to do with path dependency and succession. So the regimes are transformed with the materials that are at hand from the previous sequences of practical and visionary conflict. And they then, in turn, shape what comes after them. But the crucial point is that this path dependency is variable. A regime can be developed that either reinforces or weakens this power of the past over the future. We have a stake over time in the creation of regimes that diminish the power of the past over the future. Those are the regimes that are best able to innovate and to assimilate innovation. That means that they contain this power of path dependency. The third observation is this. A crucial factor in the formation of these regimes is that the tendency is to assimilate an organizational or technological innovation, such as the innovations that are at the heart of the so-called knowledge economy, in a form that minimizes disruption to the dominant interests and the established preconceptions. And let's call that form the path of least resistance. So the path of least resistance is the way of innovating that is least disruptive to these ruling ideas and interests in the society, in the sequence. But the path of least resistance is never the only path. There's always an alternative to the path of least resistance. And the creation and imagination of this alternative is the proper subject matter of transformative practice and transformative thinking in the world. An advantage that those who want an alternative to the path of least resistance have is that the path of least resistance is characteristically always associated with some containment of the potential of the innovations. In order to minimize the disruption, you must also minimize the achievement of the potential. So the enemies of the path of least resistance have an advantage. The advantage on their side is the promise of radicalizing the potential that the path of least resistance shortchanges. Now I come to the second set of remarks about development economics in the light of these general ideas about institutions. First, what was the central message of classical development economics? By classical development economics, I mean the development economics that was created in the aftermath of the Second World War to the end of the 20th century. The central message is take workers and resources from the less productive sectors of the economy and put them in the more productive sectors. Meaning, basically, take them from agriculture and put them in industry. Conventional Fordist mass production industry. That was half of the message and the most important part. The other part of the message is respect the fundamentals. The fundamentals are institutions and education. In the long term, the fundamentals constrain development. But in the short term, you get a boost to development by transferring workers from the less productive to the more productive sector. Now, the second idea is, why is it that this message was felt to produce so-called unconditional convergence? That is, convergence to the level of development of the most advanced economies. It's the shortcut. It was seen as the shortcut to rapid economic growth. There are two characteristics of conventional industrialization that help explain unconditional convergence. These two characteristics are distinct, but they're connected. The first characteristic is that the technological and organizational core of traditional industrialization is stereotypical. It's a small package of machines, like the metal cutting lathes, and of capabilities associated with the use of these technologies. And the second characteristic is the minimalism of the requirements, particularly the requirements having to do with the so-called fundamentals, institutions and education. Development economics paid lip service to education, but the truth is that very little education was needed for conventional industrialization. What was needed from the workers was a disposition to obey, rudimentary literacy and numeracy, the ability to read and understand instructions, and physical dexterity, especially hand-eye coordination. Nothing more than that. And for institutions, what the development economists required was a conventional, regulated, mixed economy, no fundamental change in the legal organization of the market, and a place for a planning commission or a planning bureaucracy of some kind. Nothing more than that. So the combination of the minimalism with the stereotypical character meant that this was a kind of portable kit that you could take anywhere and parachute down with minimal requirements, and it would produce the unconditional convergence. Now, the third remark about development economics. This story about the short-term boost to economic growth was in fact enveloped in a larger narrative to which development economics was never attentive. Look at any of these episodes in history that later came to be described as so-called growth miracles. And it turns out that in each of them, there were two factors involved. One factor was a mobilization of national resources led by the state. Financial, economic, physical, and human resources, a project. And the other factor was a transformation of particular sectors, opening up opportunities and capabilities, access to economic opportunities and capabilities in those sectors. So the crucial point was the interaction between this mobilization above, led by the state, and this sectoral opening up down below. And it wasn't restricted to this episode of industrialization of the late 20th century. Take, for example, the United States in the first half of the 19th century. Way before mass production, it was Hamilton's project of massive mobilization of national resources, and then there was selective opening or democratization of the sectors that were then key, agriculture and finance. And that's what helped build the United States, that interaction. Now comes the fourth remark about the meaning of this development economics, its limitations, its selective blindness. In these so-called growth miracles that were the real context of economic success, not just this short-term boost produced by the sectoral shift, the path of least resistance, as I called it, played an enormous role. So the shape of the growth miracle was constantly downsized or contained by the attempt to minimize disruption to the dominant interests and the established preconceptions. Take the example Danny gave of China, which he presented here, hopefully, as an example of success. But in another respect, it was an example of failure, because these innovations that he listed have many of them withered. At a certain moment, they seem to be points of departure for a reorganization of the market economy in a different form. But now, retrospectively, it seems that they were just transitory adaptations of the organization of the market economy to the political and economic power of the state. So the township village enterprises, for example, seem to have largely withered. And the two great forces that are always responsible for this containment, for this downsizing, the path of least resistance, are politics and thought. A limitation of the struggle over alternative structures. That's what democracy would be, the collective creation of the new. And a limitation in the ability to understand structural alternatives. The dominant forms of thought, fossilized, shrunken Marxism on the one hand, or second-hand American social science on the other, the two main intellectual currents in these major developing countries, were both of them inimical to structural imagination. So this then is the legacy of this episode of thinking about development that we have from the second half of the 20th century. Now I make my third set of remarks, the bridge to the discussion of the knowledge economy. The problem of immense practical and theoretical interest is that, as Danny has said, the formula of classical development economics no longer works. The formula of taking workers and resources from the less productive to the more productive sector, from agriculture to industry. Now, why has it stopped working? And I want to provide an account that doesn't contradict what Danny says, but I hope adds something to it. And to provide this account, I have to say just a word about the character of what comes next, the knowledge economy. So the knowledge economy exists in these confined vanguards. It exists now in every sector of the economy, not just in industry, in knowledge-intensive services, in precision scientific agriculture, but in every sector it is a fringe from which the vast majority of workers and firms remain excluded. This confined form of the advanced form of production has now undergone the following transformation. The firms that control this advanced form of production have discovered a way to routinize or commoditize part of their process of production. And these parts they've then farmed out, they've subcontracted to firms and workers in other parts of the world, working in the traditional style of mass production. So mass production now appears in the world in two forms. One form you could call the leftover. It's the old form of Fordist mass production that survives. The other form you could call the sidekick. It's the subordinate executant, the executor, a part of the process of production of these advanced firms. Now, why then has the formula of classical development economics failed to work? The first and fundamental reason is that conventional industrialization is no longer the vanguard, the top of the world economy. It's a subordinate, relatively backward form of production. And it characteristically is commanded by the advanced form of production. That's what I call the sidekick. The second reason is that the combination of the advanced form of production with the sidekick is able to outproduce or outcompete the conventional industrial firms to produce better at cheaper prices. The third reason is that the leftover form of conventional industrialization is then driven to a race to the bottom, seeking the countries with the lowest wages, with the lowest tax burden, and the depression of the returns to labor in turn inhibits further innovation. And the fourth reason is that in this new context, the very distinction among sectors, which was crucial to classical development economics, begins to be effaced. Advanced manufacturing, in a sense, consists in crystallized intellectual services. There's no clear sectoral distinction. The distinction is degraded. Now, all of this transformation is to some extent obscured, not just by our lack of understanding, but by another feature of the situation, about which classical development economics remains silent. The feature is the way in which the structural alternatives tend to be concealed by the structural imbalances in the world economy. So take the relation between China and the United States, for example, in the recent historical period, the two most important economies in the world. There's wide agreement that China now needs to develop by deepening its internal market rather than just by export-led growth. But the deepening of the internal market is not a trivial operation. It requires massive redistribution among classes, regions, and sectors. And that, in turn, has to be organized politically. The export-led growth has been, in a way, a form of evading this task of internal structural transformation. Now, look at the other side of this situation, the American economy. The Americans stopped producing enough goods and services that the rest of the world wants. That was part of the background to the crisis of 2008. But they maintained a strategy of credit-fueled and debt-supported economic growth in the context of the export of the Chinese trade and capital surpluses. So once again, the perverse relation between the Chinese and the American economies was, for the Americans as well as for the Chinese, the alternative to structural transformation. Now, against this background, we then come to what emerged last time we taught together as a central dilemma. The central dilemma is this. The traditional formula of development, which was this movement of workers and resources from agriculture to industry, from the less productive to the most productive, no longer works for all the reasons that I just cited. But what's the alternative? The alternative would be to establish the knowledge economy in a form that is socially and economically inclusive, that includes a very wide range of firms and of workers. Now, if even the most advanced countries in the world have failed to achieve that, how can we expect these major developing countries, with all of their constraints, to accomplish it? It seems to be inaccessible. That's the dilemma, that the traditional formula of development no longer works, and that the alternative to it seems to be beyond reach. That is now beginning to emerge in the world as the central topic of debate.